At some point in your programming career, you're probably going to write some solution that uses the internet. Um, I actually had a boss who used to ask coders how the internet works. And he was always surprised how few people at that point in time, I mean, this admittedly is 15, 20 years ago, could explain just really basically how the internet works. How, outside of like, hey, I hit a web page and stuff shows up. What are the mechanics that underlie the internet? Now, this is going to be a how the internet works very much in a nutshell. I am definitely not going into networking. I'm definitely not trying to make you an expert here, but I want to give you a little bit of framework to be able to start a deeper investigation that you might do based off of your interests. So if you're interested in networking, you're going to go way, way deeper. If you're just programming, you'll go somewhat deep. But the history is important to understand that initially a computer did its own thing, and if one computer wanted to talk to another device or another computer, it would use ports kind of like what you see here. Um, these kind of look like what we have seen in some things, like they kind of look like one of these things, an Ethernet cable, where there's a bunch of little different metal contacts, and each metal contact allows information to go between computers. And essentially, what these are is ones and zeros. Each one of the little pinholes that go into these ports can represent a one or a zero and translate data between them. The Ethernet cable is significantly more elegant of a design and allows that information to go back and forth. But that's what is really important to remember is computers store data as ones and zeros, they process data as ones and zeros, and thus they share data as ones and zeros. So at a core level, that's how computers talk. It's up to programmers to give meaning, a greater meaning to those ones and zeros. So as we start communication, all we really need to do is plug two computers into each other, and one of them ships ones and zeros to the other one, and that one knows how to interpret those bits into meaning and then send them back. Now, as we put more than one computer together, we have greater needs. So, if we just ignore the networking side of it, if you're talking to one person on a telephone and you know you're talking to one person, then everything you say is addressed to that other person, and everything they say is addressed to you. In basic idea principle right there. But when you have a room full of people, who's being addressed and who's sending messages to and not talking over each other becomes a really big important thing. So networking and the internet is about establishing an identity of each machine and then organizing them into groups to allow the information to be able to go from point A to point B in a reliable manner. And so a lot of the internet is about how do we route messaging around appropriately. And so you may have heard of IP. You may have heard of the phrase TCP/IP, and this is the IP part of it, which is the Internet Protocol. And you can kind of think of it kind of like a old letter. You're going to send something somewhere, but instead of an address, what you're going to see is something like this. So you're not talking about some conventional zip code address sort of thing. You're talking about a IP address, which is in IPv4, there's four specific numbers, uh, theoretically between 0 and 999. But that's not normally the range you see, but there's four specific numbers that identify a individual computer or device that can speak on the internet. And there's also this notion of return address, which is you. You have your own IP address, but locally you see yourself as 127.0.0.1, a concept also known as localhost. That's your local IP address because sometimes we use our own local address to get to things. For example, if you want to browse a website on your own computer that your own computer is hosting, that's definitely something that can happen. Now, you probably are quite aware you don't type in these big long numbers all that often when you want to go use the internet because there's a layer that sits on top of it that's called the URL, the Uniform Resource Locator, which essentially is a way of looking up stuff online. And the core of that is this domain name service in the middle. You have a domain name like Google or your university name or whatever your favorite place is, and then the top level domain is .com, .biz, .net, .edu, and then the subdomain is entirely within the uh, the domain itself. That can be your mail, it can be your World Wide Web, it can be whatever that might be. Um, and so, but the idea is the name, the domain name plus the TLD is a way you can look up the IP address and then know what machine to talk to from there. And then all the rest of the stuff coming before, the protocol, the path, everything else, that's very much specific to the software and the data you're trying to transmit. But the core of the internet is that domain name and the top level domain, google.com or whatever your domain name may be. And so your computer then uses the connection it has. So your computer probably is connected to some router, Wi-Fi, or directly connected, plugged in, and then that connects to some sort of modem device. Probably, it could be a cable modem. In this case, it's the telephone modem that's pictured. It could be directly to a fiber optic connection. However, it's going to be connected, and then that goes off to your internet service provider. So there's some hardware in the middle, and for the most part, we don't care about that hardware in the middle. But we know we have the internet service provider, and the service provider then gets into the big extensive land of networking. And so when we talk about networking, you can deal with such concepts as switches and hubs and routers. DHCP is what dynamically allocates the IP addresses to different machines, whatnot. We can deal with firewalls, which are security measures, and all sorts of things there. And that's well beyond our scope. But that's the real core part of the internet right there, is each machine has this little address, and if I can look up somebody else's address, I can communicate with that machine by just sending requests. And it's all the magic of the land of networking that routes our requests appropriately. So we're going to dive more into this, but that's the start of how I get from my keyboard and mouse to my application to the internet in general, and then back to another application servicing my work. And that's what we're going to be talking about next.